Now for tonight's guest, Thom Hartmann has a very varied and fascinating career. He's a former therapist, writer, political commentator, and the host of the nationally syndicated radio show, The Thom Hartmann Program, which has more than 2.5 million listeners every week. He's a 4-time winner of the Project Censored Award and the best-selling author of more than 20 books on topics as varied as attention deficit disorder, American history, the assassination of JFK, and contemporary American politics. He joins us tonight to discuss his latest book, The Crash of 2016, The Plot to Destroy America, and What We Can Do to Stop It. Please give a warm welcome to Thom Hartmann.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be back in Seattle and back in Town Hall. I love this venue, and it's wonderful to see all of you. And special thanks to Town Hall Seattle for helping organize this, and especially to Elliott Bay Books for showing up. I know that I think our publisher kind of dropped the ball on some of the hardcover Crash of 2016s, but they have book plates that I can sign, and that way you can put a signed book plate in the book later if you'd like. So just, get the business stuff out of the way, as it were. The message that I wanted to share with you tonight is a pretty simple and straightforward one, and I'm going to try and do it fairly briefly, and then we can do some Q&A. And that is that George Washington did not fight the Revolutionary War to free the East India Company or the billionaires in Europe. And that Abraham Lincoln did not fight the Civil War to free the corporations, the big railroad corporations and the land barons and whatnot. Most of us take this for granted. We think that, this is the history that we know and understand. But the fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court over the last 30 years has asserted that both of those things that I just shared with you are not true. That George Washington actually did fight the Revolutionary War to protect the billionaires of Europe, and that Abraham Lincoln fought the Civil War to free the corporations. And, I always thought he fought the Civil War to free the slaves, but apparently not, if you ask Judge Scalia. So, as a consequence of this, we are experiencing right now a genuine crisis of democracy in the United States. We have, a very, very low voter turnout. And it turns out, a lot of people, you ask them, why don't you show up to vote? And they say, well, because, it's not going to matter. Sometimes they get a little sophisticated and, it's, both parties are bought off, or twiddledum and twiddledee, or whatever. But really, ultimately, at the bottom, at the end of the day, what they say is that, I don't show up to vote because it's not going to matter, because it's the top 1%, or at the worst, the top 10% who get what they want legislatively. It's the special interest groups who get what they want legislatively. It's the big corporations who get what they want legislatively. It's not me. And now, just in the last month or so, what was his first name? I think it was Nathan Gillen. Yeah, I had him on the radio on Tuesday. I'm forgetting his first name. But anyhow, Dr. Gillen of Princeton University just came out with a study where they went back and they looked at over 20,000 pieces of legislation over a 20-some-odd year period, or 10,000 pieces of legislation over a 20-year period. And what they found was that, in fact, it's true that what the 50th percentile wanted, what average Americans wanted, what the 10th percentile wanted, what poor people wanted, didn't happen. I mean, it would happen or not happen at a rate that roughly corresponded with random chance. Whereas what the top 10% wanted, or what special interests wanted, or what corporations wanted, happened consistently. This is not the definition of a democracy. A democracy should be, there's these first 3 words in the Constitution, we the people. That is a democracy. That's how a democracy should work. And so, Martin Gillens is his name. In fact, yeah, I actually have a note about that. We've been here before. This is not the first time we've seen a crisis of democracy. The last time that this happened was at the end of the last Gilded Age. And we are now in the new Gilded Age, as you've probably heard many times. And the last Gilded Age was in the late 19th century, and you had the robber barons, and they basically controlled Congress. In fact, they bought members of the Senate. You know, the Senate was not directly elected. They were appointed by the states, and these people would literally buy their way into the U.S. Senate. And the people rose up and revolted. There was a great crash in 1896. And in large part as a consequence of that crash, we saw, and then it was followed by a war, the Spanish-American War. And the outcome of this was a populist and progressive rebellion. And that populist and progressive rebellion led to some substantial changes. In 1909, the Tillman Act was passed, for example. Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president, passed the Tillman Act, which made it a felony for a federal official to give money to any political candidate for federal office. There were laws passed in virtually every state in the United States that made it a crime for anyone to give money to anybody for any political purpose. In fact, I have a copy of one of these laws. This is just incredible. This is an actual state law. This is from Wisconsin. Tell that to Scott Walker, right? This was on the books. I mean, this is one that came out of that progressive backlash era, and it wasn't taken off the books until the 1950s. And here, I'll just read it to you, very straightforward. No corporation doing business in this state shall pay or contribute or offer consent or agree to pay or contribute directly or indirectly any money, property, free service of its officers or employees or thing of value to any political party whatsoever, or organization, committee, or individual for any political purpose whatsoever, or for the purpose of influencing legislation of any kind, or to promote or defeat the candidacy of any person for the nomination, appointment, or election to any political office. And then the penalty. Now, and this wasn't just a, gee, wouldn't it be nice? Here's the penalty phase. Any officer, employee, agent, attorney, or other representative, right? In other words, even a lobbyist, anybody who shall violate this act shall be punished upon conviction by imprisonment in the state prison for a period of not less than 1 nor more than 5 years, and if a domestic corporation, it may be dissolved, and if a foreign or non-resident corporation, its right to do business in this state is forfeit. I mean, we knew how to respond to corruption by big corporations and wealthy individuals, and we did. And it wasn't just the Tillman Act, and it wasn't just laws like that. We had many states, Washington State is one of them, passed laws allowing or altered their constitutions, allowing people to go around the legislature and directly change or affect their laws. Many states, at a federal level, we passed the direct election of the Senate so that we get to elect our senators. Women got the right to vote. This all came out of this. I mean, and these, by the way, those two things were constitutional amendments. People say you can't amend the Constitution. No, you can. It's not that difficult. And in fact, during the last progressive populist revolt, when we needed to take back democracy from the whack jobs, we did it. And so, and we did it quite quickly, actually. I mean, it took about a generation. It took about 2 decades. Our current crisis, however, is in many ways more severe than that crisis was. Because back then, you didn't have a Supreme Court saying that George Washington fought the Revolutionary War to protect the East India Company and the billionaires in Europe, and you didn't have a Supreme Court that said that Abraham Lincoln fought the Civil War to protect the corporations. Back then, there was no doctrine that corporations are people or that, they were trying, right? Santa Clara County in 1886 and several other decisions, but they really, really didn't have corporate power back then like that. And there was no idea that money was protected by the First Amendment and that corporations were protected by the 14th Amendment. In fact, in 1976, in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, which was the beginning of the end, really, of the idea that money and free speech are different things. It was the beginning of the blending of the two. But even in that decision, they didn't go that far. Instead, they said that money was, quote, that you could regulate money in the political process because you could regulate conduct. And it was a regulation of conduct to regulate money. And now the Supreme Court, of course, says if you try to regulate money in the political process, you're regulating free speech. And, you know, I didn't know that money was speech. I mean, I don't hear that many things coming out of my wallet, you know, out of my pocket. It's not, hey, down there, no, let us out. It's not happening. But all that changed with Citizens United and McCutcheon, and now corporations have become people and money has become speech. And, you know, at the same time that money has become speech and the corporations become persons, there's an interesting history to that. It goes back to 1886. When the Supreme Court didn't decide that corporations are people, but the clerk of the court, John Chandler Bancroft Davis, said that it did in a head note, and that's been quoted forever. And I wrote a book about that called Unequal Protection, and it's like the biggest scam that's been foisted on the American people. But in addition to that, we now have, you know, a whole series of Supreme Court decisions since that time that have basically, you know, ratified that notion that the corporations are people. And this modern era started with a fellow by the name of Lewis Powell. And this gets into the crash of 2016. This is about the middle third of the book. In 1971, Lewis Powell was a tobacco lawyer in Virginia, a nice, soft-spoken guy. He was actually a very gentleman. He was a Southern gentleman. But he worked for the tobacco industry. And a few years before that, a couple of big things had happened. One was that Rachel Carlson had published Silent Spring in the 60s, in the mid-60s, and produced this incredible movement, this incredible backlash of people saying, no, wait a minute, yeah, I want to know what's in my food, I don't want these pesticides and things. So that happened. And then on top of that, you had Ralph Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and about how the car companies didn't give a rat's patootie about us, they just wanted to make a profit. And that sparked a consumer movement. And so suddenly corporate America fell under siege. And Lewis Powell, being a tobacco lawyer, could see what was going to happen 20 years out in the future. I mean, you know, he couldn't literally see the future, but he had a sense of the way things were going. And that, you know, the way things were going was that, you know, we the people were going to come after them. So he said, you know, in this memo to Eugene Sindor, his next door neighbor and friend at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he said, we've got to get politically active. The Chamber of Commerce has to get politically active. Up until '71, the Chamber of Commerce had always just been basically a business organization. I mean, hang on just a minute, this wire's making me crazy. I'm going to give it a little slack here and try and hook this thing. There we go. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce had not been a political organization prior to that point. And so what he was saying was we have to capture the courts and the judges. This led to the creation of the Federalist Society. We need to create think tanks to influence public opinion. That led to the creation of the Heritage Foundation and others. We need to take over the schools, so now we have colleges all over the United States where right-wing foundations and right-wing billionaires fund political departments and economics departments and control who gets hired and who's allowed to teach and what books are used. We need to take over Congress, basically. We need to own our politicians. And then Lewis Powell, 3 months later, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And surprise, surprise, he helped write the opinions in the Buckley case, and a year later in First National Bank versus Bellotti, which was the first time that the United States Supreme Court had said that a corporation had political freedom of speech, that they conflated the two. The First Amendment and the 14th Amendment were somehow tied together. Now, it got tied together really, you know, all in a bow in Citizens United in 2010. So, as a consequence of this, we're back where we were in 1906 when Teddy Roosevelt was railing about the influence of money in politics and calling for the Tillman Act and for laws like that Wisconsin law that I just read to you. He said, you know, we've got to change these things. And so, and again, people are saying, but you can't amend the Constitution. It's too big a job. It takes too much time. It's a big hassle. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, we did back then, and in fact, most recently, the 26th Amendment of the Constitution in 1971, it was proposed in March of 1971. It was ratified in July. It took 3 months. It took 3 months and 8 days. The big song that was #1 on the billboards that year was Barry McGuire's Eve of Destruction. And in that song was a line, "You're old enough to kill, but not for voting." And the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. And it was, of course, during the Vietnam War. And people were upset about the fact that they could be drafted, but they couldn't vote. And so I still think that we can pass a constitutional amendment in 3 months and 8 days. It's still possible. And in fact, you know, this is yes on I-1329. This is the effort here in Washington State to make that happen. And here's the amendment that is proposed. This is from movetoamend.org, but there's a bunch of good ones out here, but just some very simple, straightforward language. This is what we need to say. Because keep in mind, no legislature has ever passed at the state or federal level in the history of the United States, no legislature has ever passed a law saying corporations are protected by the 14th Amendment and are people, and speech is and money is protected by the First Amendment and is considered speech. It's never passed any legislature in any state or at the federal level, ever. No governor has ever signed such a law, no president has ever signed or even proposed such a law. In fact, presidents have condemned such laws or such policies since literally the 1787 Grover Cleveland State of the Union address, in which he talked about the iron boot of corporations being on the necks of ordinary citizens. It's a verbatim phrase out of his 1887 State of the Union address. Go back, look it up. So this amendment is very, very simple language. Section 1, the rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons only. Artificial entities shall have no rights under this Constitution and are subject to regulation by the people through federal, state, or local law. In Section 2, the judiciary shall not construe the spending of money to influence elections to be speech under the First Amendment. Now, there are a few more words in there, but it's straightforward stuff. So how do we make this happen? We get active. And that brings it down to the very, very, very simple thing. Tag, you're it. Thank you very much. And so I'm gonna actually let that be my the main. Well, actually, not my whole speech. I want to talk a little bit about the crash of 2016 because that's theoretically the reason why I'm here. But the crash of 2016 is coming about because of what I just shared with you. It's coming about because our political process has been so badly corrupted by the corporations and by the billionaires that they've ruined our banking structures, they've ruined our business structures, they've ruined our trade structures, and our economy just doesn't work anymore for anybody who's not part of the 1%. And the crash really, what really set it up in a big way was not just Reaganomics and not just free trade policy. Those guaranteed that America would slide into third world status. But what really set up the crash were two pieces of legislation that were promoted by Phil Gramm, whose wife Wendy was on the board of Enron. And these were bills that Ken Lay wanted passed. And the Commodities Futures Modernization Act and Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And what these did is they allowed companies like Enron, to become banks, because Enron was having problems with banks. They had 800 subsidiary companies they were playing shell games with, and the banks didn't like it, and they wanted to be their own bank. And B, they wanted to be able to gamble within their own bank with commodities, specifically energy commodities. Enron didn't live to see the day, but the banksters are still doing it. They're still at it. And they're doing it in particular with food and oil in ways that are really, really harming our environment. And so we had this crash that started in 2007 with the housing collapse, that went large in 2008 with the stock market crash. And then President Obama was came into office, and during that brief little 9 or 11-month window there, between the time that Ted Kennedy died and the time that Scott Brown got sworn in as his replacement, out of the 6 years that the president has been president, he's only had a filibuster-proof Senate for 10 or 11 months, for less than a year. And during that period of time, he got like 27 pieces of legislation passed through both the House and the Senate, including a massive stimulus act that literally prevented us from sliding into a Great Depression, Obamacare, and a whole bunch of other really good, some good stuff actually happened. But these Republicans are so committed to making sure that this president, and for some of them, it's just because he's a Democrat. I mean, they felt the same way about Bill Clinton. They kept trying to impeach him. But they did actually vote for legislation during Bill Clinton's presidency. But for some of them, it's that he's the first black president, and they just can't deal with that. And they just are so committed to this guy going down in history as the failed president that they're not allowing anything to happen. We have the lowest level of legislative activity in the history of the United States, literally in the history of the United States. And it's because if he likes it, they won't go for it. And if he doesn't like it, well, you know, it's obviously it's not going to happen. So, but it's like so it's just it's crazy. And so the fundamental changes that needed to happen in 2008, when George Bush was president and the crash happened, when the banks started falling apart, we have a precedent for what to do when banks start falling apart. And in fact, Ronald Reagan showed us in the United States. Sweden did it in '97, but we saw it here in the United States in 1987. In '83, Reagan deregulated savings and loans, which led directly to the crash of the savings and loans. And that crash of the savings and loans then just, set up, for all practical purposes, made inevitable, frankly, made inevitable the idea that there would be a stock market crash. Excuse me, the crash of the savings, when Reagan crashed the savings and loans, what he did was he nationalized them. And nationalizing the savings and loans, he basically said to the stockholders, you're screwed, you guys. You're losing your investment. The stockholders lost their investment. He fired all the senior management. He prosecuted, over 1,000 of them were prosecuted, over 800 of them went to jail. Charles Keating was the most famous of that bunch. Sent these guys to jail. And eventually, he hired a guy named Bill Seidman, who ran the Resolution Trust Corporation, and over the period of the next 25 years, he sold these nationalized, now federally owned savings and loans back into the public market, into the private market, and actually made a profit for the government on the S&L crash. Sweden did the same thing with their banks. This is what George Bush should have done in 2008. He should have said, okay, cool, we'll break up the banks and we'll take over the banks. We can run banks. It's not a secret. There are good people out there who know how to run banks, and they'll do it for a reasonable price. You don't have to pay Jamie Dimon hundreds of millions of dollars. But George Bush chose not to do that. Instead, he and the Fed chose to hand literally tens of trillions of dollars to banksters and rich people, not just in this country, but all over the world, to try to keep this crash from happening. And when Obama came into office, there had already been 2 TARPs passed. There had been basically an amnesty for the bankers, and there was no way that he could get Congress to go along with doing what Reagan did in '86, tragically, because the die had been cast by George Bush, in large part, and also because they were just committed to destroying the Obama presidency. And so we still have, as a consequence of this, a broken financial system. And so what they've been doing for the last 6 years is just reinflating the bubble. And it's a bubble economy. And you read the Financial Times and the papers, where the rich people are talking to the rich people, and they're all like, are you in cash yet? You getting out of the stock market yet? It's like everybody's just, they're walking on eggshells because they know that another crash is coming. I suggest 2016 because if you look back at the crash of 2008, the Bush administration knew in 2006 that crash was coming. They knew in 2007, the second quarter of 2007, when housing starts dropped 30%, which they had done in 1927. The numbers were almost identical. They knew that when what happened in 27 happened in 2007, what happened in 29 would probably happen within a year. And so they were trying to stop 1929 stock market crash scenarios from happening before November of 2008, before the election. Because they knew that, having a Republican go into the election would not be a good thing in the middle of a stock market crash. But they couldn't do it. They miscalculated. They couldn't, the forces were just too great. There were hundreds of trillions of dollars of these derivatives out there. And so the crash happened. I see the Obama administration doing the same thing. And I don't say this out of malice or spite or, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's politically the smart thing. Is, you want your party, and in fact, I want a Democrat to be elected in 2016. I would rather the crash did not happen before November of 2016, because the future of the Supreme Court is at stake. Even if it's a mediocre Democrat, I don't care. I don't want a Republican appointing a bunch of Supreme Court justices, and Scalia is in his late 70s, Kennedy is in his mid 70s, you've got, Thomas is in his late 60s. You've got a bunch of these right-wingers who are reaching the age of retirement, or even possibly, I'm not wishing it on them, but people do kick off. And so, they're trying to hold this thing off until 2016. And I'm not sure they'll be able to do it. It might happen next week. It might not be for 2 more years. But it hasn't happened yet, and it will. Because the market fundamentals, the systems are broken. Our basic core systems are broken. And until we fix those systems, and frankly, I don't think we're going to fix those systems until there's a popular outcry, and I don't think there's going to be a popular outcry until there's a crash. And I hate to say that. I know a lot of people are going to get hurt by that crash. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people have been hurt by the crash of 2008 and by the Republicans for 6 years trying to make it as painful as possible for people, cutting off their unemployment, not doing anything about the mortgages, all these other things, and trying to make it as painful as possible for people so that they can win political advantage in the elections. It's terrible, terrible politics. But this is how it's being played out right now, in large part, starting with Lewis Powell's memo. So we've got to do something about that. We've got to get ready for it. And when that happens, when that crash happens, there will be that populist opportunity. There will be that populist moment. I see it building right now in the popularity of people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. You see this, and on the right, frankly, with the Tea Party, what you're seeing is populism. You're seeing people saying, we're being ignored, we're being screwed, we're not going to put up with it anymore. We may not know who's ignoring us or who's screwing us, but we're not going to put up with it anymore. And so I think that when that crash happens, when that moment in time, when that opportunity is there, we need to be ready. We need to have our friends educated. If each one of us can wake up 4 or 5 people, tell as many people as possible, so that we can do what the progressives and populists did the last time we went through this cycle, where they amended the Constitution twice. They passed a bunch of very, very substantial laws. They reinvented American society. Look at what Franklin Roosevelt did with Social Security and the WPA and the CCC and the TVA and all these other things. We can do this again. We know how to do it. It's not like it's never been done. It's not like we've never figured it out. So get ready, and there's tremendous opportunity here. There's tremendous opportunity here. And climate change is, of course, roiling the waters. It's making all of this even worse. And here's an opportunity for us also, as people are waking up about the dangers of climate change, to transition ourselves from a fossil fuel economy to a solar economy, which could be the equivalent for the United States of the Industrial Revolution of the 1870s. I mean, it could be the biggest thing that ever happened to this country. And all we have to do is get the fossils, forgive the pun, out of the way. We've got to move the fossil fuel industry and some of these old Republicans in office out, and that means, again, back to what I said earlier and what I say on the radio every day, getting politically active. Tag, you're it. So that's it. Let's do a short question and answer here. I do this on the radio every day. We've got microphones on both sides. If one request I would ask is, if you want to give a speech or or inform me, call the station, use our message board. There's a whole variety of ways to get information to me. But if you have a question, I'd be glad to answer it. Sir?
There seems to be a real poverty of leadership among both parties. And I'm wondering, when these problems, where are we going to find the people that can objectively lead us out of these, recognize the situation it is and lead us out?
That's a great question, and your question presupposes what I call the great man theory of governance. It assumes that you need the right person to lead us. And when we look back at history, we say, wow, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these great men, where are they now? I'm not a fan of the great man of theory of history. I think that what you find is that people step up to situations. Franklin Roosevelt is probably the most classic example. Franklin Roosevelt was a rich guy. He was a privileged guy. He had no great compassion for the common man. I mean, he was not a wild progressive as governor of New York. He was a reasonable governor. But New York was arguably the most corrupt state in the United States. It's a huge political machine in New York. Governor Roosevelt did nothing about that. He ran for president in '32 on a platform of free trade and dropping tariffs and slowly continuing the plans that Hoover had put into place. But when he got into office, he had an Occupy movement to deal with. I mean, they had left by the time he got there. Hoover had busted them up. But for 2 years, you had people who had camped from the White House all the way down to the Potomac, the bonus army. He had a nation. Every bank in the country failed the week before he went into office, before he became sworn in March of 1933. And so the Times propelled FDR. And that's why, people call up the program and they go, oh my God, we're going to get Hillary Clinton for president. And my response is, I'm no huge fan of Hillary. I think that she's a very smart woman. But I also know she was on the board of directors of Walmart back in the day. Of course, her husband wanted to become governor of Arkansas, and that was sort of the dance you had to do. But she does know how to take names and kick ass. And I do believe that that she or any other Democrat, frankly, if they have the intestinal fortitude to take the opportunity, and if the situation is severe enough, they'll do it. So I'm not so concerned about where the leaders are going to come from. I'm concerned about the timing of the circumstances. Yes.
Speaking of timing, the time is now, and you're absolutely right. My name is Libby Carr, and I'm the campaign manager for 1329. And the time is very, very propitious right now. We are at a point where we have to consider hiring paid signature gatherers if we're going to make it onto the ballot. So many of us don't want to do that, but I think the majority of us want to be on the ballot because we know the state of Washington is at a very important time in history because this is the largest effort of a citizens' initiative in the country to date. And a lot of states are looking at our state. I've gotten calls from Illinois and other places wanting to do this. Right. So my question for you is, will you help us? And what I mean by that, Tom, is we need the media exposure now.
Sure.
And I think the idea is that if we can get the country focused on the state of Washington to send us the money that we have got to have to get on the ballot, we will then pay it forward to the next